As ethnic nationalism rises globally, Muslims face growing challenges to their identity and sense of belonging. This seminar explores what it means to be Muslim in states that prioritize ethnic nationality over religious identity. We'll discuss how Muslims in such contexts preserve their faith, maintain their sense of Muslimness, and build connections through shared belief. What could global Muslim solidarity look like in today's divided world? Professor Salman Sayyid is a globally renowned scholar in decolonial thought and critical Muslim studies, a leading theorist of Islamophobia and post-Western political theory. He has held prominent academic positions worldwide. His groundbreaking works have earned international acclaim and shaped contemporary debates on Muslim identity. Thank you so much for coming, Mr. Salman, and you can go ahead.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you everyone for being here. I have maybe 3 or 4 things to say, and I'll try and say them concisely as possible so that we can have more time for some conversation rather than just me talking. So let me start off with a very basic proposition that I hope I don't have to labor today. And that is that I think we all know that things are wrong in many, many Muslim societies. Gaza is just one example of illustrating what is wrong with the world. It's a very powerful example, but it tells us, here we sit while there's a genocide going on. Yeah? But we also know that this is not the only way that oppression is being played out involving Muslims or Muslimness in the world right now. And we can trace the various lines. We can look at the case of the Uyghurs, we can look at the case in Kashmir, we can look at the case of the Rohingya or Muslims in Burma or India, and you can multiply these examples. So it shouldn't take us too long to think that even at a very basic point, there is a question that we can all agree upon, that there is something precarious about Muslimness, which isn't just about losing identity, however we mean that, or people losing their faith, or the kind of complaints that the old always make about the young, that they're not as Muslim as they used to be, and etc., forgetting when they were young, as often in the cases. Here we're talking about something which is existential. Yeah? We're talking about not just people's attitudes and the clothes they wear, etc. We're talking about life and injury. So the question then is this: we know what is wrong, but do we know how to put it right? And I would say to you that is a really, really important question that we need to think about, not only in any specific context, but more generally, because I hope we can see that what is happening in one place isn't necessarily specific to that place. To give you a simple example, many of the techniques used in the occupied territories of the West Bank among policing are then redeployed in other places, like, for example, in Kashmir, or sometimes redeployed in policing in what used to be called Western democracies, but let's call them what they are, Western plutocracies, governments by the rich. So we know that if you take statements from a minister from the European Union talking about countering violent extremism, and you take a statement from an Indian minister or a Chinese minister, you could swap that, you could play a game, because they say exactly the same sort of things. They will talk about extremism. They will talk about how they are Muslims are are being infiltrated. They'll talk about how they do not fit. All sorts of things, right? So we know there's a similarity in all of these things. So the question then really is, if there is a commonality to the way in which this sense of making Muslimness so precarious, so vulnerable, why isn't there a commonality of responding to this? Why is it that the Muslims are not able to come up with a common strategy to deal with what I would call is a global Islamophobia? So Islamophobia is global. Attempts to counter it are not even local. They don't hardly ever exist. So that is a question that we should be addressing. Because if you have a situation where you have, on the one side, a force, a social force, which is coordinated and concentrated and determined, and on the other side you have an inability to even recognize the danger, an inability to agree upon any kind of parameters for action, what will be the consequences? Now, in that regard, it seems to me the most important question we should be asking among all these other questions perhaps can be condensed into what is to be done, which is, I suppose, the first question in any sort of situation of conflict or a situation of politics, because the political is just another name for conflict. So whenever there's a conflict, you ask yourself what is to be done. And part of that answer must be, who are those who agree with you and who are those who disagree with you? And what do you do with the disagreements? How do you manage that? So this is why the second question is, who are your friends and who are those who oppose you, right? So these two questions actually become really, really critical in any situation of conflict, whether it's at the level of the state or the level of the international order, or even in local government or in an office or in a workplace, etc. If you think in your life, whenever you've had any kind of conflict, you will be acting out those two questions in some shape, way, or form. Yeah? If you see something that doesn't work, some kind of injustice, you think, okay, what can I do about it? And how do I get someone to agree with me, and who are the ones who stop me? If you think about when you make a complaint about anything, when you are unhappy about something, same thing happens. So these two questions then, about what is to be done and what are the sides in any conflict, I think are really, really important. The challenge that we face is that to carry out those questions, you need to be open to the idea of what constitutes or what makes up the ability to understand what is to be done and who our opponents and who our allies are. And it's not, if you play chess, it's very easy. There are pieces which are all colored white, and there are pieces which are covered black, and therefore everything is clear. But in life and in this world today, there is no color coding to tell you what is good, what is bad, who are your friends, who are not your enemies. So now you have to imagine that you're playing chess with everybody the same color. And that requires another kind of discipline. Now, the reason why I say that there's no, it's like playing chess with one color, is because we live in a world which is dominated by ethno-nationalism. If we are talking about ethno-nationalism and we're talking about Muslimness, isn't there a tension? Shouldn't there be a tension? How many, sorry? Sorry? Okay, the question is this, that I'm arguing that the reason why we can't tell the difference between friends and enemies, the reason why we can't answer the question of what is to be done, is because the lens through which we see everything is dominated by ethno-nationalism, which means that we think that the way that humans are is primarily defined by their nationality stroke their ethnicity. Okay? And that means that the idea of Muslimness is still in tension with the idea of ethno-nationalism. How many people here have a Muslim passport? Everyone, maybe not. Most people have ID or passports belonging to particular countries, which allow you certain kinds of access and not other kinds of access. And the access doesn't depend on whether you're Muslim or not Muslim necessarily. Okay? Now, the question then becomes, is why should these two things be in tension, and what is the way to resolve them? The talk of the ummah is something that's based on the idea that there is a community based upon people's Muslimness which cannot be limited to any particular ethnicity, any particular nationality. Yeah? And we then say, yes, but look, the Muslims are divided, but we never understand how that came to be. And we don't understand our own complicity in that division. Let me give you an example. Just before the first round of the last presidential election, I saw a YouTube video where there was a debate between Erdogan and a hijabi woman asking him in one of these kind of meetings, this is just a few days before the vote, asking him, what are you going to do about the Syrian refugees? Yeah? Because now the question is this, why are they here? This is the implication. And the question struck to me, well, why would she be asking that question? Why does that matter where a Syrian, either they are here or there? And it was interesting that his answer was that I don't agree that they should be expelled. They are going to be here as long as it needs to be here, which is quite rare for a politician in this day and age to make the point. Now, there are a number of issues here about what does it mean to think in terms of nationality, and what does it mean to think in terms of ummatically. And ummatically must be transnational. It must be something that goes beyond the nation state, because most of the nation states were based on the idea of expelling Islam and Muslimness from public life. So if you think about a way in which most countries are based on notions of having an official language, privileging particular historical accounts, and you could say, yes, all nationalist projects are based on ethno-nationalism of some kind, right? What then, how does that prevent us thinking about the question about who our friends are, who our enemies are, and what is to be done? Because the argument is that every nation state has a national interest, and that national interest sees nothing beyond the service of that nation state. Now, if this was the case, what you understand is all political loyalty belongs to the nation state. But the nation state isn't just a political thing, it's a cultural project as well. And how often do people speak of the nation state and understand their Muslimness only through the guise of the nation state? You may have heard the formulation Arab Muslim. People use it all the time. You don't hear with the same frequency the formulation of Turkish Muslim or Persian Muslim. Now, how does this formulation of Arab Muslim come about? So that my argument must be, well, not all Arabs are Muslim, but not all Persians are Muslim, not all Turks are Muslim. That can't be the explanation. You often see, for example, in history books, talk about an Arab empire, the Arab conquest, rather than the Muslim conquest, or the Muslim empire. Now, these are just minor points, but this is to do with a particular writing of history in which the meaning of an ethnicity is projected back into time. So we read what it means to be Arab today from what we thought the same, what it meant to be Arab before. And it's not about Arab. The meaning of the word Turk today is very different than what it meant 100 years ago, very different than what it meant 150 years ago. And you can again multiply these examples with many, many times. So the investment on ethno-nationalism is an investment in a particular kind of history and a particular kind of political project. And that political project runs up against the difficulty of Muslimness, and as a result, that political project is always going to be hostile to iterations of Muslimness. And you see this in many different places where restrictions on the expression of Muslimness comes in the name of finding a pre-Islamic history for a country. Right? You can see that under Saddam, under Iraq, where this is Mesopotamia. Because successive Egyptians talk about, we built the pyramids. Now in Saudi Arabia, that this is really about the Nabateans. In all of these countries, there's an attempt to try and recover a pre-Islamic justification for the country. And if you discover a pre-Islamic one, you are saying, well, this is the more authentic. This is what we really were. So again, people may ask it's one of the odd things, when you do surveys, most times, many Muslims always put down the most meaningful identity for them is being Muslim. And then people say, well, what does that really, what's underneath that? If you put down your ethnicity or your nationality, people rarely ask, what do you mean? If you say you are Turkish or you say you're Bosnian, it's not investigated, well, what is underneath it all? Because the idea is that ethno-nationalist identities are real and being Muslim is superficial. It's like the paint. It's green paint on houses. The houses are the real bricks, and no one asks about that. But I would say to you that there's no reason to assume this. But once you deny that that is real, then you start saying that Islam itself is simply paint. It's cosmetic. It doesn't have any significance. And if you say that enough, then you start thinking it doesn't really have any significance for anything else. So we then have a position in which Muslimness is considered to be secondary to ethno-nationalism. I hope that's clear what I'm trying to say, yeah? And I hope that you have experiences and readings that would confirm or at least plausibility of what I'm saying. Okay? So that then leads us to an issue about what is ethno-nationalism? Why is it that people think so many times in ethno-nationalist terms? So, the answer that is often given is that ethno-nationalism is somehow natural, that nationalities are natural. And really, people have always been that nationality underneath. Right? This is why it's so important to find those nationalities in prehistories. But if you reflect upon this for a moment, it's completely absurd. So what is behind this is the idea of European racism, which argued that human beings were like species and they had these transhistorical linkages that you could tell different types of humans, races, and that's what they really were. The difficulty has been that of almost 150 years of trying, no European science could ever come up with a consistent number of races. They couldn't identify races. So one of the definitions what they tried to use was the idea of the races like a species. But in species, an animal species, one of the definitions and one of the things is that they can't, species can't intermarry. So to preserve racism, you had to have so many laws to prevent intermarriage, but why would you have laws for something that was already biologically given? I have never seen or heard of anyone saying you have to have a law that humans should only breathe oxygen. It doesn't make any sense. So if it's something that could not be done, or humans should not have wings, there's no law ever. So you had so many laws precisely because you could not have the boundary of species. And races themselves were constructed. So you'd have these things, there are 5 races, 8 races, 3, and they could never make up their mind. But from that, then once they gave up after the Holocaust, this idea of biological determination of racism, they began to talk about races in terms of cultural traits. So they say culture. And one of the things that we have in the various projects to dealing with extremism among Muslims is this Muslim culture that is violent, that is misogynist, that is the problem. And what is this Muslim culture, which is all of these things? It is very, very difficult to work out what that means for anyone at any time. So we need to understand ethno-nationalism not just simply as a political project, but also as a culture, as a way of producing knowledge, and ultimately the way of producing us. We think in ethno-nationalist terms. Look at all the markers around us. You see flags everywhere, right? In some countries you have flags in mosques. Think about that for a minute. What does that actually mean? That you have a flag in a mosque. You have the ability, if you ask people what nationality they are, they're able to respond automatically. But it isn't just the question of nationalities, it also sits on something else, and I want to use the example. We have just entered Europe. We just crossed the road from Asia to Europe. Okay? We didn't feel any different. We didn't suddenly feel we were more civilized suddenly as we crossed the Bosphorus, we came over there. But what is Asia? How many people here would say that they come from Asian countries? Can we just have hands? Okay, would you also accept that what we call Asia now has some of the oldest historical records that we know of, right? Going back almost 3,500 years, 2,500 years from the present. In none of these records do we have an idea that any of the people who lived in what is now Iraq, Tigris Euphrates, or the Indus Ganges, or in the Yellow River and in China, none of them ever thought they were Asian. They never say, dear my fellow Asian. This doesn't happen. Almost for 4,000 years, they never thought they were Asian. When they start thinking about Asian as common, is because the world was mapped out in the 16th century by European map makers. And they began to formulate this notion of Asia, which then those who were in those places began to internalize. And it was almost 100 years ago in the 19th century where people in China and Japan started talking about Pan-Asianism as a way of opposing European rule. And similarly, in Africa, everyone says, well, everyone knows it's Africa because you can draw it on the map. It's quite straightforward to draw. But again, there was no Africa before European cartography. If you think about Africa, there is so many differences in so many ways. And we don't have any record of people right at the tip of what is now South Africa thinking right where Nigeria is, this is the same people, this is the same continent. So if you accept with me that the modern definitions of continents come from European map makers, then I would ask you, where is the continent that we call Islam? And if Islam doesn't have a continent, then what does it say for the way in which we understand the world? Now you may say this is a minor point. This is just flimsy. But look, take one of the most useless organizations on the planet for a minute, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, okay? And if anyone wants to defend it, I'm more than happy to listen to its defense, but it is useless in so many different ways that I'm not sure that we could spend the hours talking about how useless it is, 101 useless things that it can do. Having said that, it is the largest organization, one of the largest organizations in the UN, and it is the only, or significantly the largest organization which has membership from all the other continents. This transnationality, I would say to you, is a marker of Muslimness in a way that there isn't other alternative markers of Muslimness in the same way. So even though we have this decrepit organization, there is still some desire that one day something like it will prove used to something. So all of these things show you that Muslimness exists beyond national borders. This is its strength and this is its threat. Every single attempt in this world to try and oppress Muslims, or those who consider to be Muslims or Muslimness, always works by nationalizing Islam. Whether it's in France or Austria or Iraq or Egypt or Indonesia or wherever. Whenever you hear someone say, we want a national Islam, what they mean is an Islam that has no linkages between the ummah. And when they say that, they mean Islam that has become devoid of anything. So every project of national building becomes not only Orientalist, but also Islamophobic. And as a consequence, the ability to address some of the problems that we've talked about is already undermined by the fact that our imagination is so captured between these kind of ethno-nationalist, or what I would call Kemalist dreams. Because the idea of that is that modernity or modernization is necessary only for ethno-national. You have to become a nation state to be modern. And in that you have to be secular to be modern. And you have to be Western to be modern. And what are the groups of people that stop you being modern? Who are not secular? Who don't belong to the country? Who are the ones who you cannot contain in one nation state? Every instance of Islamophobia is an instance which dramatically threatens the idea of a ummatic dimension to Muslimness. Some of the most powerful and consistent Islamophobes in the world are those who also say their prayers 5 times a day. They're also those who would say, I am a Hafiz of the Quran. But you can read the Quran and not enter its spirit. You can say your prayers and still not recognize the injunctions that require you to be part of a community that goes beyond that. So we then have an issue then that let's recognize that the conflict between ethno-nationalism and Muslimness is central to what is unfolding. The next part of what I want to say, and I just want to be brief about this because I'm taking up too much time, is the idea of religion. And let me start off by saying, I know this is recorded, so this could probably get cut the wrong way, but I hope you will bear witness to what I'm saying. Islam is not a religion. This could be, of course it's not, it's a way of life. You could say that's right. Or you could say, how can you say Islam's not a religion? Let me give you a small example. If I said to you, Islam is not, where does it say in the Quran, Islam is a religion? You would say, well, deen means religion. That's what we normally say now. But I would ask you, when did deen become to mean religion? One of the earliest translations of the Quran into English occurred before the concept of religion was established. As a consequence, wherever deen appeared in the Quran, in that English translation, it's translated not as religion, but as law, sacred law. Think for a minute, if we thought Islam meant law, or custom, or nomos, not religion, what would change? Once you start thinking Islam is a religion, you are now involved in a pattern where religion is a concept that emerges to describe the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment view of its own history. And therefore, in the mid-19th, late 19th century, Europeans discovered there were 14 world religions. And every religion is a defective form of Christianity. So you have the model, and then you have these defective elements to it. And that means 2 things. One, it means that many Muslims try and make Islam a proper religion, and that means copying, becoming more Christian. And I would argue that one of the dangers that Muslimness faces is its Christianization. If you go to most Muslim bookshops, you will find often 1 or 2 books talking about against Darwinism, right? This is rejecting Darwinism. Has anyone wondered why? Because Darwinism became a problem for Christianity. It is a problem for Christianity because the Bible says the earth is only 6,000 years old. Please correct me if anyone can find out where the Quran says that the earth is only 6,000 years old. It doesn't say that at all. Therefore, it's not a problem. It doesn't exist as a problem. But why do we need to import problems for other theological systems? Because we want to prove that we are a religion. And a religion is what a Christianity is. Then you have this thing, but in religion you have to keep politics separate from religion. But that only depends on a particular reading of what religion is. If you don't start off with that concept of religion, there is nothing to keep separate here. So you can say, okay, so what if people complain that Islam has to be against Darwinism? But there's something else in that. In Western Christianity, one of the most important metaphors is the one of incarnation. God is incarnated in the body of Jesus, and therefore when Jesus is crucified, a part of divinity is crucified. What this means is that the relationship between human and divine is on the same plane. It's a zero-sum game. So if science advances, religion must fall back. Yeah? But among a Muslim conception of the divine, there is no way that Muslims can think they are in competition with the divine. It's a different plane. It's not that if we climb 10 more steps, we become divine. It is impossible. But once you start thinking in those terms, a lot of consequences start happening. So we are at a time right now, and this is the final point that I want to make, that we face these problems, but we are not aware, as we should be perhaps, of the lenses that we face these problems through. As a consequence, the solutions that we come up with are problematic because they repeat what is the cause of the problem. And we are then caught in this cycle. We keep on doing this thing and we undermine what we're trying to achieve, because what we're trying to achieve is based on a very unexamined way that we've come to see these problems in a way. So part of us must be to start thinking in ways that allow us to decolonize, and I mean decolonize properly, how we understand the world, but that means we need to decolonize how we understand understanding itself. And this is an enormous effort. It cannot be done quickly, but it has to be done if we want to make Muslimness less precarious in this world. Because as long as we start thinking on assumptions in which Muslimness is something problematic, something that shouldn't really be happening. Muslimness is a scandal. There should be no Muslims in the modern world. If we think along those grounds, even if individuals we don't believe it, but everything around us tells us this, then we cannot go better than that. So, I've spoken for too long, I think, but I will stop there, and I'm more than happy to hear any questions or anything that you think I need to clarify, or some things you disagree with, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
I'm curious. I understand the problems and the way we have to dismantle the way we're thinking, but what are like practical, actionable things that we could do to even begin making a dent or walking towards this kind of unity? Should I be like, if someone's asking me like who I am or asking me to identify, should I like be firm on me just being Muslim and not talk about me being Pakistani on the side? Like how does this manifest or begin to manifest?
Well, if you start saying you're Pakistani or you start saying Muslim, you have different, it depends on the conversation you're having. But I would say to you, one way would be to think of yourself or argue that you are you think of yourself as a Muslim, and that's an unfinished project. That it is not something that's the end. There are very few Muslims that I've met who would admit to being, they say, or Muslims often say, Islam is perfect, but I am not. And alhamdulillah, the more Muslims there are like that, the better the world will be, and they continue to be like that. So I think the idea is this, that you can say, yes, I'm a Muslim, but then it's not just about saying it, it's how do you enact that? How do you enact that in your various ways of openness to other kinds of framing of Muslimness? So one argument would be that most Muslims live in societies where our literacy about the different schools of thought is quite limited. So it means relearning the past so we can understand the future. And wherever you see the use of ethno-nationalist descriptions, you should challenge those wherever appropriate. So when you see someone talking about the Arab Caliphate, for example, or the Arab Empire when they mean the Muslim, you should point that out. So the armies that landed in Spain were led by someone who was a Berber. So when people talk about Arab, they erase that notion in lots of different ways. There were no, the notion of Arab as an ethnicity and Arabic as a language is really, really problematic, because in reality, the way that we speak languages does not change our DNA or inheritance or whatever. So those are the kind of arguments I would suggest.
Thank you so much. My question is, I'm questioning actually, why do we need to devalue nationalism, and try to be more attached to our Muslim identity or identify ourselves as Muslims instead of our national identities? I was having a conversation with a cousin of mine. We're Palestinians. Some of us are in Jordan. Some of us went to the Gulf. Some of us went to Lebanon. And we were talking about the importance of our refugee status and how important it is to hold on to it, no matter what passport we get, no matter where we go to the world, because it's important to the Palestinian resistance and Palestinian liberation. And what she told me was that she does not identify with Palestine, and therefore she doesn't feel the need to come back, and that Palestine to her is just a Muslim land that is occupied by non-Muslims. And yes, she once celebrated Palestine, but not because she's Palestinian. That doesn't mean anything to her. And I found that problematic because when we give up on our national identities in this regard, we kind of see ourselves detached from our lands, from the ungiven rights that we deserve. And I felt the need to actually be more attached to my national identity, because we also know that during the French colonization of Algeria, the French were telling Algerians, since you guys are all the same, and since you guys are all Muslims or Arabs or whatever, you can go to Tunisia, you can go to Morocco. Why are you so, holding on to your Algerian identity? And also looking at the so-called Muslim world, I feel like Muslims are very different in these different parts of the Muslim world. And although being a Muslim is an identity, I feel like it's not unifying us in a political sense. And I think you gave a great example by talking about the Islamic cooperation, the OIC, exactly.
Yeah.
And my question is that how about an identity that clearly is a manifestation of decolonization or decolonization project? What about dividing the world into a global south and a global north, for example? What do you think of this idea? Do you think it serves a decolonial?
That idea would also be against nationalism.
Sorry?
If you divide the world just into global north and global south, it would actually be against nationalism as well. So the two issues here, I think, well, three. Firstly, I think the condition for doing justice in Palestine is not to do with the attachment to the land per se. It's to do with the attachment to the expulsion and oppression of the people, right? And the fact that it's happening in Palestine, it could be happening anywhere else, and you would also say that this is absolutely wrong. So one of the issues about Palestine right now is that in many ways it's one of the last vestiges of a European type of colonial settler state in its raw form. So that's one of the issues there. Now, there are many, many Palestinians, and in the 60s they were very, very prominent, who try to articulate the Palestinian conflict not in terms of Muslimness, etc. So many Palestinians, for example, argue we shouldn't be talking about Islamophobia, we should talk about anti-Palestinian racism, and we should be talking about this as being very specific to Palestinians. But look, if this was only an issue about those who are Palestinian, and let's problematize what that would mean, I would say the Palestinian struggle would be in a much weaker position. So when you see demonstrations in many parts of the world where Muslims are not a majority, most of the people who are demonstrating are not Palestinian. They're not even Arabic speaking. There's a very, very large segment of them which are actually Muslim. If you took away all the Muslims, you would be reduced to a much, much smaller group. But that, for me, shows something which is really, really important, that the struggle for justice for Palestine is a political struggle, because a political struggle transcends any narrow notion of interest. If you are only interested in your own concerns, that's not a political struggle. If you say, I want to, my housing is improper, rather than taking it and saying, right, all of us should get together because the housing conditions are terrible, for example. That makes it political. If it's only about an individual or a small group, then it's not political. So the fact that people march who are not Palestinian shows that the Palestinian struggle for justice is a struggle for justice for all. And that's really, really powerful. But the attachment to the land, I would say to you, is not the decisive part. Because you could have, and you do have. Imagine there was no genocide and only apartheid, in which case there would still be the land. You could say, right, all the Palestinians who have been kicked out can come back in, but they can only live as third-class citizens, have no rights. Would you be happy with that? So that's what I would say to you. The land is not an unimportant question, but I don't think it can be a decisive question in relation to political projects. Because the political projects that search for transformation are actually not political projects which are specifically attached to a particular kind of lands. And also you could look at the history of Palestine, how has the population affiliation changed over time? So I would say to you, I'm probably more agree with your cousin than you on this matter, but forgive me if I'm stepping in family things that I don't want to do.
Yes, so I'm familiar with your, well, first of all, thank you for your talk, Dr. Sayyid. I'm familiar with your chapter from the Critical Introduction to Khomeini. So I was just wondering, like in the context of your talk today, your thoughts on the Islamic Republic of Iran, maybe other institutions that have created some amalgamation of nationalism and Islam, Nation of Islam, and the Republic, and there's Afghanistan as well, Pakistan. And actually, I have a second question, and it actually could be the second part to this first question. You mentioned something regarding a transition from race to culture. So I was just wondering if you could maybe unpack that more.
Okay.
Maybe it has something to do with the epistemology of them. I'm not sure.
Okay. I think that's a really interesting question. One of the things I want to try to get across to you is that political positions and movements change with time. So to give you an example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, in the first decade or 15 years of that, let's say a bit more, Iran hosted something like 2 to 3 million what we would call refugees, mainly from Afghanistan. But they gave them the status of Muhajir, right? As a consequence, when you talk to these people now, they said, look, being a refugee is a terrible experience. There's no doubt about that. But even within that, they were better when they were called Muhajir. Then there was the election of Khatami, who was considered to be a liberal president. And one of the liberal presidents they did is try to modernize, which meant westernize aspects of Iranian treatment, and it changed the status of Muhajir to refugee. So as refugees, then they became unable for them to speak, talk, use their own language in their schools. They became vulnerable to expulsions. They then became joined in that kind of lexicon of how refugees are treated, which is different than how Muhajirs would be treated. After all, where did the Prophet go when he was chased out of Mecca? If you want to follow the Sunnah, then that opens up these things. So I think what I would say to you is this, that the Islamic Revolution opened up a project that was against ethno-nationalism in many, many interesting ways in the early part. It then became what I would call more and more Kemalist over time. It became more and more statist, more and more nationalist. And as a consequence, it became less able to represent an ummatic consciousness with the same degree that it had done so in the early period. So that's where I think the tension is right now with it. I think the question you asked about race and culture, I want to be very clear about this, that the idea of race was always was encultured, in a sense that because there was no scientific, there's no way to demonstrate race. Race does not exist. It's actually constantly constructed and policed. It was there. But what I'm using within the literature, there's an argument, which I think is some kind of thing, that the idea of race initially, up till about, I would say, more or less in 1945, after the post-Shoah, the idea of race was dominated by biological determinism. They really thought that it was your genes, it was your actual blood, it was something physical in your biology which determined race, your racial categorization, which then determined your temperament, your intelligence, your skills, all of these things, what made you more or less of a human, right? And that carried on for a very, very long time, and it reached situations that, for example, in many, many countries, I can give you an example from London. The London Fire Service used to have 8,000 people in its ranks. And London's population at that time was something like 15 to 20% of Londoners were people of color. But there was only about 100 firefighters of color, right? And when they were asked, the fire chiefs were asked to explain why in a population where you have such a large segment of color, but you have no firefighters, all firefighters are white, they said, well, the thing is that, and just to let you know, in London, the two biggest groups were people from Afro-Caribbean background and people from South Asian background, okay? So they said the reason is this, to be a firefighter, you have both a physical test and a mental test. The Asians were able to do the mental test, but not the physical. The Caribbean people were able to do the physical test, not the mental. It's only the white people who could do both. Now this was in the mid-80s. They were using that, right? And that's what you explain all these things. Now this is basically racist knowledge working through, but now we talk about it in terms of culture rather than saying it's to do with biology, etc. You say that those are the kind of, so the idea of culture is that you explain these practices, which you used to use biological explanations, to now say, well, it's how they're taught, it's how they're socialized, etc., etc. And the idea there is a static culture throughout time. So that's what I was trying to hint at, that people don't, it may come back in fashion by the time they may start finding the racial gene, etc. but that was the point.
How
Yeah?
many questions do you want? Any other questions? Okay, we can have last 3 questions now. 1, 2, and 3. And we're wrapping up.
So, yeah, my question, actually, I have a comment and a question. The comment was about the word our sister said that our lands. And actually, as Muslims, we don't believe that we have our lands. Al-ardu ardullah. It all belongs to Allah. And we just fight for the freedom or for the justice whenever it is. So if like I'm from different place, I'm not Palestinian, or I'm not called or labeled by the name of it, now I don't have something to do with it. No, actually, I would fight for it, and I might stay there if I like the place there. So al-ard ardullah, that like one of the main concepts in Islam. But with the same way, Islam never had a problem with belonging to something else, not Islam. But the actual thing that Arabs in the past, they didn't belong to the Arabic ethnicity because they were belonging to their clans. So he was Al-Adani, he was Al-San'ani, Al-Ahmar, whatever, okay? And the other Muslims were like Al-Farisi. And there was like Tariq ibn Ziyad al-Amazighi. So they were like al-Bukhari we have. So Islam doesn't have a problem with belonging to a group of Muslims. But the problem with ethno-nationalism that it's fake. There's nothing called Egyptian. What is Egyptian? Who's there? Like, are you Nubi? Are you from Upper Egypt? Are you from the modern Egypt? So are you a farmer? So there is nothing called Moroccan. What is a Moroccan? If you are an Arab, where did you come from? Are you Kanani? Are you Adnani? Or if you are an Amazigh, so you are an Amazigh, you are not Moroccan. So ethno-nationalism is a fake belonging. That's why it clashes with Islam. But Islam is fine with like, you can belong to a group and then become a Muslim, and it's all together the ummah of Islam, and everyone can identify himself or like represent himself with the group of people he came from, and yeah, he's just a Muslim.
I mean, I think I agree with you in large part, but I would just say two little things. Firstly, the idea of the clan as becoming a proto-nation is problematic because that's what's happened. And the idea of the clan as being somehow a biological thing is also problematic because we know many of these groupings are built through fictive notions of affiliation, etc. So that's one element. I think the notion of diversity is quite clear. So for example, one of the ways you can think about the wars of Ridda occurred not because there were matters of belief. There were many, many people who were not Muslims but agreed to pay zakat. And it was the paying of zakat what actually gave you the membership or citizenship of the Muslim state.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to be a Muslim to pay it. If you agreed to pay it, that's it. So I think for those reasons, I would say to you, yes, it's not a question about belonging. The question is how that notion of clan is read retrospectively through the notion of a biological notion and then a kind of ethno-nationalist notion. And the question about fakeness is that ultimately I'm not sure everything is not fake in some way or another. But I agree with most of what you're saying.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I'm grateful for the intense introductory. I only have a comment about the issue land that our sister put on the table. So I think this kind of issue is very popular on the surface of the discussions between Muslims and Palestinians, and especially Arabs and Palestinians. And lately, it even came to surface in so many Arab countries, like in Yemen, for example, which is a country that is very rare to hear the national voice, but it really came to surface in the past days. And I think it's the kind of issue that cages the haqq and batil that the Muslims are supposed to fight for. For example, we have this ayah that straightens the meaning in the nafs, where it says إن الذين توفاهم الملائكة قالوا فيما كنتم قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها. And we can see this also in the seerah, where after the freedom of Mecca, Prophet Muhammad he sent all the Sahaba back to Medina after only 3 days. because they're staying in the Medina, in Mecca for the ultimate taklif of Muslims at that time was an inability for them to just إقامة هذا الدين وإقامة هذا الحق وإعلاء كلمة الله سبحانه وتعالى. So I think the question that should put on the surface, when I think this is a hawa nafs of loving the land, we should put the question of taklif. Every Muslim has to ask the question of what am I supposed to do to be answering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He asks me, you have this amana, you have this istikhlaf, what did you do on this land? It's Somali, Yemen, Palestine, wherever we are, we should really be this sincere with ourselves when we talk about the aqidah. Because I think caging the Palestinian issue with the land is just it's a foreign, it's a strange idea for this ummah. Even before 15 years, when I was a child, I used to open the TV and for hours and hours, and I would cry for every single person that dies there. Now, I don't see these kind of emotions between our kids because of this kind of voices that come on the surface that is strange to our ummah. Yani. So I think this is a very important point that should be discussed and should be the shaitan should be faced on this. Yani.
Thank you. Sister?
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Just to jump up on what the sister were saying. So I think the issue that we are facing with the Palestinian struggle is that we have to adapt ourselves to the actual system to justify that Israel is actually colonizing Palestine. So I think it becomes such a struggle to make people understand that there's a Muslim nationality with the war and terror and everything. I think so. That's my first comment. Second of all, according to you, do you think that secularism and the development of secularism has played a bigger role in emphasizing nationalism? For example, I'm French, so people as Muslims, we have struggled so much on being accepted by French, and this comes up at every layer, at having an apartment and having a job, being accepted at school. So it comes up at every layer. So I think that now it would be very difficult to make people understand or to have like a nomadic consciousness within the French Muslim, I take just that as an example, the French Muslim people, when they have struggled so much on being accepted as they are. And on top of that, they have developed also a certain, I call it obsession for their country of origin. So now you have French, like you have Algerian French Muslims, and you have Moroccan French Muslim, and you can have like in a very small town several mosques which belongs to certain countries, which is of course a problem. But how can we install this ummatic mindset in those type of environment? Thank you very much.
I think what you've said is very important, because I would say the answer to your question is in many ways very straightforward. Stop being Orientalist, because everything you've said is exactly the problem that we face. Okay, so the idea that to be accepted, French Muslims are wanting to be accepted, and they've made so many strides. How's that going? France is probably the most Islamophobic country in the world, and some would argue it's the most dangerously Islamophobic country, because at least with places like, you can always dismiss India or China and say, well, they're not proper, they're not liberal, or it's compromise. But if you cannot be a Muslim in France, then where on earth can you be a Muslim? So the risk of Islamophobia in France means that there's a book by Edward Said and John Berger, I think, which is called After the Last Sky, and it's about the Palestinian experience, and it asks basically where would so from the poem by Darwish, where do the birds fly after the last sky? So if you cannot be a Muslim, or Muslimness cannot exist publicly in France, then it becomes unsafe everywhere. That's the first point, right? And I would say to you, if you look at the issue on the headscarves, right? And that hasn't been enough. Now it's an issue about the length of skirts. Now it's an issue about ability to practice. Look at the fact that organizations which have been documenting incidents of racism and Islamophobia, anti-racist organizations, they are being basically shut down and people threatened with all kinds of actions. They've had to go into exile in Belgium, and this is unrelenting. So I would say to you, if that has been a success story, please save us for any more success. But the reason I think it's a problem is because the idea of being French, and then French Moroccan and French Algerian, and the argument, well, they have these associations, and they're really, all these mosques are French Algerian mosques. Most structure of mosques in the West is very, very straightforward. Most mosques are built by groups of retired men who've known each other for 30, 40 years very often, because they're dealing with cash, they're retired, so they may be moving in, there has to have a high level of trust. They then build the mosque in reflecting demographically whatever the area may be. I have yet, alhamdulillah, had to be excluded from a mosque because of my presumed nationality or ethnicity. I've never experienced that. I have known mosques which at one time were East African, Asian, then they became Somali, then they became Kurdish, and then they became, because as the population moved, the mosque didn't move, the congregation. And so you go to, and I don't know about France, and you may tell me, if as a Moroccan, you go to a mosque which is designated as a French Algerian, what will happen to you? So the point is that, so when people say this is a French Algerian Moroccan mosque, what are they actually saying? They're already making the division that we're being internalized. Because if you're saying, now, there is one mosque in the UK, I think, in London, which says that only Indian Muslim can be member of the committee. So even the Prophet could not be a member of this mosque. So, but I would say to you, that's a special case. And alhamdulillah, it's a very rare case. And I don't know if anyone else has had the experience that if they've gone to say prayer in a mosque, they've actually been turned away because your passport doesn't. Now this may happen, the world is a very big place, but alhamdulillah, it hasn't happened to me, and I hope it hasn't happened to anyone else. So when people say this is what they're doing is privileging ethnic national identity and missing the point of what a mosque is. A mosque is basic. Most people's relationship with a mosque is to go there to pray, to go there to study, to be part of the community. Most people do not run the mosque. And the running of the mosque itself reflects particular situations. And so I think when we start talking, and then the idea of all these immigrants really care about their own countries, this is a trope that has been circulating for almost 70 years in Europe. And the problem with all of that is at the same time they want to say that Europe is overcome by 20 million Muslims. Those 20 million Muslims or 30 million Muslims used to be called Kurds, Turks, Pakistanis, Maghrebis, Senegalese, etc. So when they use these labels at a certain point, and then they say that we're being swamped by Muslims, you can't have it both ways. So my kind of thing is this, that I would be very, very cautious about saying that the project of making national Islam is actually going to make you stronger. It will actually weaken you, because the next thing, only Algerians should be able to go to the French Algerian mosque. I mean, come on. So I would say, but this is what a lot of the anthropology and ethnography which is produced by Orientalists go around saying this. But they will ask you that outside a mosque, so where do you come from? What is your ethnicity? Where do your parents come from? And you will say, okay, my parents are from Morocco or Yemen or whatever, or I am from Yemen and Yemen. And that becomes a Yemeni ethnic kind of mosque. Where what is the identity of a mosque? It happens to exist in a particular place. People go, say prayers. The buildings may change, the people may change, but it doesn't, I would be shocked. There are small differences, but everyone here, if we all went to Indonesia tomorrow, to Central Java, and it was Jummah, I think all of us could manage to navigate that position. We would know that you take off your shoes, that you this. There's nothing that would be a shock to us. Or if we went to, anywhere in the world, even if you go to a country like Iran or something like that, you can say, okay, they may do some things differently, but we will manage. So I don't know what it means to say this mosque is French, Moroccan, or French Algerian. They're realizing their ummaticness. In the end, there is no way of thinking that Islamophobia will simply stop at the Algerian mosque, and the Moroccan French mosques and the Senegalese French mosques will be allowed to carry on. This is not going to happen. And I think you're right, it is powerful, but it has to be contested, because this is one of the main engines of Islamophobia. That is the nationalization of Muslimness.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a concern, is that as we are discussing here the matter of nationalism, every day there are millions and millions of children that are indoctrinated on nationalism in the schools. And for me, it's like, it's not fair, because there are millions. And how do we do to counterattack this?
I think this is a really, really important question, because you are right. But you should also remember there are millions of children that also go to Muslim learning. The problem for us, first one must be to make sure that Muslim learning, the madrasas, are not themselves nationalists. Because if they're getting nationalism from both ends, then I think it's a more complicated problem here. So one of the things we need to do is, I would say, is broaden the examples by which we understand the world. It means becoming more aware of Muslim history beyond just the history around the Prophet and the companions. If I went around and asked you to name me some Muslim figures, we'll get the usual 10 subjects and we'll finish. We're exhausted. And for school children, it's even worse, that if we don't have a sense of our Muslim history and its range and its capacity, then I think it becomes very, very problematic. So the first thing is broadening that range. I'll give you a ridiculous example. During the World Cup, there was a PhD student, a Muslim, who asked me which team I would support, and I said, well, I normally support the Muslim team until there's no one left. And there was a match, I think, between England and Senegal, and I said, I'm supporting Senegal. And he asked me, but is Senegal Muslim? Now the thing is, that's 95% of the population in Senegal is Muslim. Now I don't think he was making a theological point, just didn't know. And this is a PhD student who is a Muslim, who says his prayer 5 times a day. So I think these sorts of that shows us. I've been to places where I've said, the plight of the Uyghurs, and they say, well, what is happening to the Uyghurs? And these are organizations which say they were talking about the ummatic, but they know nothing about what is happening to the Uyghurs. So I think one of the things we would do, and I think this is important, is that we ourselves have to become more aware and more willing to talk about the history of Islam beyond the history, the sacred history, the canonical history. Because that has a special category, and it gives us the impression that after the Sahaba pass away, Islam is finished. And then you can mention Saladin, or you can mention something like that, and that's it. And that is basically Orientalist narrative, that Islam finishes. Right now, there are more Muslims in the planet, both as a percentage of the population and in numbers than there have ever been. But we don't acknowledge that. So I think that's what I would suggest us to be doing.
Assalamu alaikum. Without really beating around the bush, I'll straight come to the point. As you said that Islam isn't a religion, Islam isn't just a collection of...
Let me justify that before it gets recorded the wrong way, but carry on.
Yeah. But okay, Islam isn't just a collection of rituals. Rather, it's a complete code of conduct. And by design, it seeks dominance.
I didn't say it seeks dominance by design. Did I say that?
It's not... Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, but I'm trying to understand what you're saying. I can't hear you. You said I said that, and I don't think I said that.
Oh no, you just said that it isn't a religion.
Yes, I said that.
Yeah, I'm just adding to it.
Dominance. I don't understand.
Okay,
that.
Please comment on that as well. Like, what do you think about that? Because in Islam, in Quran, Allah says that يُطْفِئُونَ بِنُورِ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَلَوْ يُتِمَ اللَّهُ بِنُورِهِمْ. What was the ayah exactly? Does anybody remember it? That these disbelievers are trying to extinguish the fire, the light of Allah, but Allah will complete the light even though the disbelievers wouldn't like it. So that's what I'm saying, that by design, Islam seeks dominance and it seeks to rise above other systems of governance and codes of conduct. Now, it's quite understandable to strive for this aim in, let's say, Muslim-dominated regions, Muslim-dominated countries, but how should this be strived? How should this be pursued in regions which are contested and where Muslims are experiencing or Muslims are facing existential threat? How should we do that?
Well, firstly, the point that I was making about religion was simply a point about the concept of religion and how deen is translated. So that was the first point, that by translating deen into religion, we bring certain associations which are not necessarily implicit. So that's the issue there. The question about dominance, I think every kind of political system, every time you want to have an argument, every time you have a disagreement, part of the reason why you're having a disagreement is because you would want to win that argument. You want to win that struggle. So in that sense, I don't think there's anything specific about that. Now, the question of how you win struggles is a very situated situation in particular areas. I don't think it leads to anything more than that. So I don't know if you say there are contested areas, I don't think there's any part of human life which is not at some point or another contested area. And when you talk about Muslim-dominated, I mean, Muslim, non-Muslim dominated societies, I don't know where Muslim-dominated societies are. There are societies in which majority of the population is Muslim, what I would call their Islamic hate societies. They're informed with that. It would be wondering whether that's a domination or what you mean by domination, in the sense it's not clear to me. But it's for me, there's nothing specific about that. People find themselves in different situations. So, for example, the restriction on observing Ramadan was passed in Tunisia in the 1960s. It was Ramadan, people were banned from fasting. It wasn't in France. So these kinds of things come and go in a way. Or the restrictions on hijab occurred, but I mean, there's a long struggle in this country to be allowed to wear the hijab. And no one has ever said that Turkey became, it was still, majority of the people are Muslims. They're buried as Muslims, they're born as Muslims. But the idea of how they were able to express that Muslimness has changed and transformed. And in that struggle for changing and transforming, I think there are lots of local reasons and things.